These are the Alaskan Mudflats. To the untrained eye, they're just a vast, beautiful expanse of shallow water and mud, surrounded by equally beautiful snow-capped peaks. But this beauty is deceptive. Over the past century, time and time again, people have walked out into these plains thinking they were harmless, only to realize they'd inadvertently walked into a death trap. These are the horrifying incidents of the Alaskan Mudflats, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. They say it happened out on the flats, sometime in the 1960s or maybe the 70s, depending on who's telling it. The story has been passed around Alaska for decades, and it always starts the same way. A duck hunter went out onto the mudflats. Nobody agrees on the exact spot anymore. Maybe it was Knik, maybe it was Turnagain Arm, but what everyone remembers is how it ended. The hunter got stuck, not just ankle deep, not just enough to be an inconvenience, but truly hopelessly stuck. By the time help arrived, the tide was already racing in, and there was no time for digging. That's when someone had the idea to call in a helicopter. A rope was lowered, they tied it around the man's chest, and the chopper took off skyward, but the mud held. Before anyone knew it, flesh gave way before the earth did, and the hunter was torn in half, and his lower body was swallowed whole and lost forever in the mud. At least that's how the legend goes. Some old-timers around Anchorage will swear they remember it happening. They can even tell you what kind of helicopter it was. Others nod solemnly, convinced it's true, but admitting they never saw a thing. Yet no record of the incident exists. There's no name, no date, and no official report. It lingers in the collective memory of locals like a ghost story or a cautionary tale passed down around campfires. But for all its shaky details, the legend holds power because it's not entirely unbelievable. Out there in the vast wilderness of Alaska, the land itself can kill you, and on the mudflats, it often does. The truth is, though, you don't need folklore to be afraid of the Alaskan mudflats. The real stories are terrifying enough. The mudflats that line Cook Inlet, Turnagain Arm, and Knik Arm stretch out like vast, silvery plains that shimmer under a clear sky. Their smooth, rippled surfaces even seem solid enough to walk across. To the untrained eye, they look harmless, like just another piece of Alaska's wild and stunning landscape. But beneath that sheen is one of the state's deadliest natural traps. Carved out by ancient glaciers, the flats are part of a sprawling estuary system where silt-laden waters meet the land. But the silt here is no ordinary mud. It's made up of microscopic grains ground down by the glaciers until they're so fine they almost feel soft to the touch. Those grains, however, are actually sharp, angular little daggers that interlock together like the teeth of a natural bear trap. When the tide recedes, it leaves behind miles of this mud that is smooth and deceptively firm. It feels solid under your first few steps, but every footfall shifts the fragile balance of grains beneath the surface, forcing the water between the grains to flow out and the mud to compact tighter around whatever disturbs it. And once the earth clamps down on a foot or ankle, it doesn't let go so easily. And geologists say that's what makes this mud so lethal. Unlike sand or regular dirt, which might release you with a little bit of struggle, this silt turns into a cement-like vice the second you try to pull free. It locks around your legs, ankles, and waist, squeezing tighter the more you fight. By the time you realize what's happening, you're already in trouble. And worse still, the most dangerous spots, the tidal channels, are the places where the mud is the wettest, where the water seeps in quickly, and the ground beneath you gives way like a trap door. And out in Turnagain Arm, that danger is magnified by one of the fastest incoming tides on the planet. Meanwhile, Cook Inlet boasts the second largest tide range in North America, with swings of nearly 40 feet or 12 meters. When the tide turns, the mudflats transform from empty plains to a drowning ground in mere minutes. On a particularly bad day, the water can rise an astonishing 6 inches or 15 centimeters every 60 seconds. This turns a single stuck leg into a race against time. And on top of all of this, the water is glacial runoff, meaning it's bone-numbingly cold even in the summer. Hypothermia is a constant creeping threat. Muscles stiffen, fingers go numb, and before long, even the will to survive starts to slip away. People have crossed the flats before, and there are stories of hikers even making it to Fire Island and back, or locals skimming across the water when the weather's just right. But with everything that can go wrong, these seem both risky and lucky. Or maybe it's a testament to the speed and skill of rescuers willing to risk their own lives in the muck to save others. The truth of the Alaskan mudflats is that one misstep, one wrong decision, and you don't get a second chance. Once they've got you, the clock starts ticking, and more than a few people have found out the hard way that by the time help arrives, it's usually already too late. And so over the years, the mudflats have claimed their share of victims, some known, some long forgotten. And it always starts with the belief that it's just mud and water, nothing a strong body or a quick sprint can't overcome. Like for example, in 1978, an unnamed Air Force sergeant made the fatal mistake of trying to cross Turnagain Arm at low tide. He might have done it before, or he might have thought he knew the rhythm of the tides and could read land, but it seems he was mistaken. The tide swept in faster than he could react and was like a wall of water racing across the flats. One moment he was a man struggling through the mud, and the next he was just gone. The search for his body stretched on, but the man was never found. And horrifyingly, this is about as tame as the incidents get. A decade later, it was gold fever that lured Adriana and Jay onto the eastern end of the flats near Portage. The couple were newlyweds and barely adults and had a day full of plans to do something known as placer mining. The sun was just rising on July 15, 1988, when they drove their four-wheel ATV out across the rippled mud. And on the back of it, they had a dredge rigged for pulling gold from the creek. Fairly quickly, though, they realized this was a mistake. The ATV bogged down first, sinking slowly and steadily. Adriana then climbed off, thinking maybe she could pull it free, and that if she just gave it one good shove, they could laugh it off and get back to their day. The second her boots hit the mud, however, it had her. At first, it was just a funny moment they'd be able to tell stories about, but as trying to free her required more and more effort, Jay soon found himself fighting against the mud too. He eventually rigged the dredge to pump mud away from his wife's trapped legs, and for a moment it must have seemed like it might work as one leg came free. A moment later though, a belt slipped on the dredge and the machine died. As this was happening, the tide began to come in. For 2 or 3 hours, Jay continued in vain to free Adriana before he found tourists nearby and begged them for help. One of them then ran to phone authorities, and shortly thereafter, an Alaska State Trooper was the first on the scene. What he saw when he arrived chilled him. The water was already at Adriana's chest. She was shaking, crying, and begged him to save her. Together, Jay and other emergency responders spot the mud, the freezing water, and their growing panic. As the water continued to deepen, Mike gave Adriana a breathing tube for when the water would inevitably rise over her head. But the cold had her by then. Hypothermia had long set in, and she couldn't hold on. So helplessly, they watched as a panicked, tear-streaked 18-year-old woman slipped under and disappeared. More than 6 hours passed before the tide went back out, and when it did, rescuers found that one leg was still locked in place. Several decades later, in 2013, it was an Army captain named Joseph who fell victim to the mudflats. Joseph was a Harvard graduate who felt a sense of duty after September 11th to enlist in the military. He would end up going to war and live to tell about it, and upon his return, he biked across the US and scaled cliffs as a talented rock climber. At some point, he and a friend set out to walk from Kincaid Park to Fire Island, thinking this would be an interesting and thrilling experience. The tide was out, the sky was clear, and the island seemed close enough to reach, but it was all an illusion. The mud grabbed hold of Joseph, and when the tide turned, it turned fast. The friend made it safely to shore, but Joseph didn't. Rescuers searched for hours and helicopters scoured the inlet, but it was too late. They found his body the next morning, washed up near the mouth of Turnagain Arm. Another decade later, it was a 20-year-old student with his whole life ahead of him. He wasn't from Alaska, he was just a visitor and a college student from Illinois who had come north with 3 friends in May of 2023. They were chasing adventure, and they were the kind of group that thrived outdoors, drawn to places most people only saw in photographs. At some point, they were exploring Turnagain Arm near the small community of Hope, wandering the flats during low tide, laughing and joking in the interesting terrain. The flats stretched out in every direction, gray and smooth as they always were. And it felt solid at first, like just another trail or a harmless patch of earth, but beneath that innocent-looking surface, all it needed was one wrong step. The student was the one who took it. Maybe he wandered just a little too close to the water than the rest, or maybe the ground shifted without warning. Either way, it happened too fast. One moment he was walking, and the next he was trapped, sinking waist deep into the mud. The earth around him then seemed to harden like drying cement. He struggled, but the more he fought, the more the silt clenched around him, compacting and gripping him in place. His friends then rushed him, grabbing his arms and trying to pull him free. As you might imagine, soon enough, their laughter had long since faded, but the mud didn't give. Panic quickly set in as they realized just how bad it was. They desperately clawed at the mud, digging with their bare hands, pleading with him to stay calm and to hold on. One of them then fumbled for a phone, breathless and shaking, and dialed 911. The dispatcher then listened as the caller tried to explain what was happening, how their friend was stuck, how the tide was coming in, and how fast it was all happening. And it was unbelievably fast. By the time the first responders were mobilized, the water was already surging across the flats, filling every dip and hollow and rushing toward him. Rescuers arrived as quickly as they could, and they brought the tools they would use for these moments, like a long water injection lance meant to loosen the grip, but there wasn't enough time to use it effectively. The tide was moving too fast, and the water had risen too high. The student fought as long as he could. His friend stayed with him, helplessly watching as the water climbed higher. The cold was unbearable, sapping his strength with every passing second. By the time that inlet swallowed him, there was nothing anyone could do. Less than an hour had passed since he first sank into the mud, and he was gone. When the water finally covered him, it was like he was never there at all. Just another life taken by the flats, the surface smoothing over, and the tide rolling on as if none of it had happened. His body was recovered the next morning after the water receded and the inlet gave him back. His death was the first in that stretch of the Turnagain Flats in decades. But despite how horrifying all of these incidents were, no story on the Mudflats feels more haunting or more tragic than what happened to a man named Roger during the fall of 1961. It was an incident so grim and senseless that it may well have birthed a legend that still echoes today. Roger was a soldier stationed nearby, and at just 33 years old, he was out on the Palmer Slough Flats south of Wasilla with 3 of his fellow servicemen. Like so many before and after them, they didn't see the danger. The crisp September air and the vast expanse of smooth grey mud stretching out toward the waterline made it feel harmless and almost serene. The men laughed and joked as they walked, and Roger may not have realized that he was getting closer and closer to the waterline. But one step too far, and Roger's boot broke the fragile surface. The mud then opened beneath him, swallowed his legs and then his hips. He tried to pull free, but the silt gripped him tighter with every movement. His friends didn't understand the danger at first, as they never do. They stood on the bank and laughed as Roger cursed and flailed, thinking he was just stuck and that a little effort or a good yank would get him loose, but obviously they were wrong. By the time it dawned on them that Roger was stuck and sinking for real, the tide had already started its silent, deadly march back toward them. Now, whether by luck or maybe fate, a local hunter named Doc happened to be nearby. He saw immediately what the soldiers didn't. Roger was in real trouble, hip deep in the mud, with the water creeping closer by the minute. Doc moved fast, dragging his small boat over to Roger, trying to figure out a way to pull him free, but the window for an easy rescue had already closed. The soldiers then scrambled, finally realizing the gravity of what was unfolding. One of them was then sent for help, but even that was fumbled. He accidentally missed the nearest house and drove all the way to Wasilla, wasting precious time as the water edged higher. When emergency services were finally notified, a helicopter was dispatched, but even that went sideways. The pilot misheard the radio call. Instead of hearing that a man was buried up to his neck, the pilot thought they said up the knick and took off in the wrong direction miles away while the real emergency played out on the flats. From where they stood, rescuers could even see the helicopter tracing wide arcs over the Knick River. Doc eventually shouted to one of the servicemen to run over to the shore and light a brush fire that might help alert the helicopter to their actual position. The serviceman then made it to shore and struck a match, but he dropped it. And instead of picking it up again and carefully trying to set the dry brush on fire, he picked up a nearby gas can and doused the match, causing everything in the air to ignite and literally blow the serviceman off his feet. Moments later, a seaplane spotted the chaos below and tried to land, but Doc tried to wave him off, knowing it wouldn't end well. But either because the seaplane didn't see the warning or ignored it, the plane tried and proceeded to flip on landing, crashing into the frigid water. And as the chaos piled on chaos, all the while, Roger was shaking uncontrollably as his body succumbed to cold while the tide rose to his chest. Doc, his 2 young sons, and the remaining soldiers did everything they could. They nearly died themselves, wading into the water and trying to pull Roger free. Doc even took the barrel of his shotgun and tried to use it as a breathing tube so Roger could stay alive as the water climbed over his head. There are moments, however, where effort doesn't matter, where all the strength, all the ingenuity, and all the desperate prayers in the world can't change what's coming. Roger was simply too hypothermic and too weak. He couldn't hold the barrel steady, and he couldn't catch his breath, and then he was gone. Just like that, he was swallowed by the silt and water right before their eyes. In the aftermath, Doc's sons would carry the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives. They were just boys who watched a man die right in front of them, helpless to stop it. For years afterward, they refused to go near the flats. One of them was plagued by nightmares and would wake up screaming about the mud, the water, and the slow, inevitable drowning they'd witnessed. The next day, the army sent in a helicopter, this one to retrieve Roger's body, but even after his death, the mud refused to give him up so easily. After a cable was fixed to Roger's body, the helicopter began to pull upwards, but the tension was greater than the cable could handle. It then snapped under the weight, sending the rescuers scrambling and decimating Roger's body. It wasn't until the army engineers arrived and built a platform out onto the flats that they could finally pull what remained of Roger free, piece by piece. It was an incident so gruesome and so drawn out that it seemed destined to become legend, and maybe that's exactly what happened. It's possible that it was Roger's death that morphed over the years into the story of the duck hunter pulled in half by a helicopter. Unlike the legend though, horrifyingly, Roger was a real man, and his death was just as real, and although his story might have been twisted by time, it's never been truly forgotten. And the danger of the Alaskan Mudflats hasn't gone anywhere either. Today, the flats still stretch for miles along Cook Inlet, turning an arm and Knik arm. The silt still waits just beneath the surface, the tide still races back, and the same illusion of safety lures people out there year after year. Locals know the risk, and they warn newcomers, tell the stories, and pass down the names of those lost in mud. But the flat, open expanse is tempting. It's always an interesting area that looks solid and it looks safe, and in fact, rescuers train for it now just because of this. They have the tools, knowledge, and experience to beat the clock, and these days, they're continuous rescues and close calls. But even with everything they know, sometimes things happen anyway. Sometimes there just isn't enough time. None of the people who died out there expected to die that day. None of them set out looking for it. They were just walking and exploring or chasing fun, adventure, or the glint of gold in the mud, and the land took them anyway. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. For those of you who listen to fall asleep, I've organized the stories into playlists on Spotify, Apple Music, and other platforms, so you can just hit play and let them run. The link for that is in the description. Also, a huge thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. We've got early access content on Patreon if you're interested. And finally, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one.